Hey guys, my name is Loco Doko, the better looking host of Listen Loco, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube channel.
Right, this is going to be another episode of Reflections, and my guest for this one is going to be Kayser, who is a scout and analyst for Vitality and has played a similar role for a number of top organisations. I will say at the beginning, this is an episode where obviously it's not someone where the raw name itself is like super famous, and obviously he's not a player, so you haven't seen him win the championship and stuff, but you'll soon find out. Like, I'll give you a spoiler right now. He was in FNATIC when they went to the World's Finals. He was in Team Liquid when they went to the MSI final. Later he was in some of the interesting Origen lineups. He was even in TSM during some of the crazy days where the roster went downhill. So there's a lot of interesting angles we could get on this. And crucially, we can talk about some of those past teams, can't we? Those are years and years in the past. But here's the interesting thing, Kez. I was looking up, because especially if I ever do an interview with someone I know, I often do double check things like, what do I know about these people actually? And when I went back and looked, one thing I actually found quite interesting is, I've noticed in people's careers, is a topic maybe we'll broach, depending on how you answer it. I've noticed actually one thing about people who are in the coaching field, if you ever look in real sports, is oftentimes if they find players that they just like or like something about, they will actually just work with those players again in their career. They just find their way back to teams, or they suggest that player later. It's not as simple as like, you just try and get the best player at all times. So one thing I was actually amazed by, I didn't know this detail, is if people know later in your career, when we talk about when you were in Origen, the team that later became Astralis, obviously one of the big controversial moves was that player from Australia, Destiny, came in, didn't he? Is he actually from Australia or New Zealand? Which is it? Do you know?
Yeah, he's from Australia.
It's Australia. So basically, people will remember he was infamously paired with Upset. People thought Upset was amazing. He obviously got flamed. He later went to America and all the rest of it. People know the rest of that, right? Now, what people might not know, I found this out myself when I was looking it up, is one of your first gigs ever was working back in Australia with the Direwolves, and this guy was on that team. I didn't know this all the way back in 2016. So this is way before anyone heard of this player in the West. So can you give me some insight into this? You knew this guy already? Was this part of why his name came up later in Origin? Was that coincidence? What happened in this sense? I didn't know this part of your origin, your actual origin story, as it were.
Yeah, so I can just give you a brief backlog. I started out, my first team was Direwolves, LG Direwolves back in the day. I think they disbanded now.
They were like, if people don't know, they're one of the top teams in that region for many years.
Yeah, one of the top OS teams. How I got on that team was I reached out to all the LEC or EU LCS teams at the time, and LCS teams with like scouting reports and player analysis documents for like their upcoming opponents and their teams, and of course no one's getting back to some unqualified or no track record staff. So I then did the same logic with Australia because they spoke English, and I was like, that's probably an easy in. Ended up getting picked up by Direwolves, and that roster was like Chippies, Surenfire, Destiny, Fantix, who's now FlyQuest assistant coach, and I'm missing King Calvin.
So a bunch of players that played in the LCS, if people don't know, obviously Surenfire was on Team Liquid, King was on Cloud9 not that long ago, so a bunch of players that we know, okay.
So that was that roster, and that is kind of how Destiny, because we were assembling the Origen roster in 2020, and obviously Origen, now I think everyone knows, had a limited budget, but we were still able to bring in Upset by taking pay cuts. That's the second, that we can talk about that later.
Yeah.
But, and yeah, Destiny's name, we were like, okay, what's a low budget player that would want to play? Because even like a lot of that was the year that Kayser, who now I'm working with, got into Mad Lions. I can tell you for a fact, Kayser that year was making like 4 or 5x what Destiny was making.
Oh, right. Wow. And if people don't know, it's not like Mad Lions pay crazy salaries themselves. So, okay, that's amazing. Okay.
So it's not like this is a minor difference in pay. This was probably 3, 4, like in.
So not many people would accept that pay, basically.
Yeah, not many people would accept that pay in Denmark, where you're getting. Yes. At the time, Origen was in Denmark.
Oh, you had to live in Denmark as well. You didn't live in Germany. That's right. And if people don't know, if you live in Denmark, you just get taxed by the Danish system, I believe. Right? I don't think you get to avoid it, right?
Yeah, unless there's like an expat tax rule that if you make above, like, I don't know what it is exactly, but it evolves year to year, like above 100 and something, you can get reduced down to a 32% tax break. But yeah, you have to live in Denmark as well, and then fly into the matches weekly.
Fair enough.
But yeah, that's kind of the origin story about Direwolves. And
No, I just thought it was weird that you actually had that connection with Destiny back then. Obviously, no one would expect it. So, okay, what I wanted to ask was this. One of the things which, even as you were describing it there, is actually one of the most interesting parts about your career to me, is I think it's only even the last few years people like truly started to give respect to coaches. Like, quite frankly, I still see fans talk about coaches where I can tell they're just judging whether they like the personality or not. They're not really able to judge like how good the draft is. Did he do a good job with these players? Like, I've seen people who get told they're idiot coaches. And then I look in the draft and say, this guy's a miracle worker. How did he like hide this guy for like, series after series? There's all sorts of things fans miss. So one thing I think they definitely don't appreciate, and quite frankly, it was the same journey with players. It took players years of having coaches before they actually would say, yeah, I have a real coach. Before that, some of them would just straight up tell me, like people like sOAZ back in the day would tell me, oh, I've never been coached. And I was like, you've literally had like 3 coaches. And that was just his way of dissing them. Well, I'll tell you what, obviously the role of analyst, still most people don't think that's legit. They think it's just, in the modern day, people still think it's just the guy who tells you, like on Korean solo queue, they're playing Lee Sin 87%. And also, did you know in LPL, pick ban on Renekton is X, people think it's just you come with like simple stuff you researched on a spreadsheet or something. So this role you've done, analyst, or it's kind of more like to me like strategic coach that they have in Korea and stuff. It's obviously had an interesting impact on all these teams. Do you feel like the role itself, has it actually evolved now? Do people acknowledge it's a real thing? Does the fact that you've had these teams now mean it's actually a real part of the coaching staff? Because I feel like a lot of teams still think coaching staff is just 2 people. It's just that the traditional head coach, the traditional draft coach or whatever, right?
I think the role has evolved over the course of however many years I've been in use for 7 years. At the beginning, it was more so just an analyst, like a one-size-fits-all. He does the back-end work on like solo queue, international reports, match prep, all of this. But then over time, I think it's evolved into where it specializes. A lot of teams specialize with the 2 different type of analysts into like data analysts and then research analysts. You can see this G2 has a couple, like many teams have multiple analyst staffs. So I think it just depends on the team. How my role like evolved over the years was I started off as just like a pure analyst that covers everything. And then over time, as like I did a lot of match preparation on various teams, I could kind of start seeing how teams should genuinely play for their current skill on the roster. So then I kind of moved into a strategic coaching role as well as a scout. So I was doing 2 roles. I was still doing all the match preparation for whatever team I was on, also while being a strategic coach. So it was a lot of teams have those 2 roles separated. I was doing both, which allowed the total staff members to be 1 less. Because I tried offloading the match preparation to other analysts, but it just never seems to work, or they don't take it on. Like the players don't absorb as much information, because you can give them a template and tell them exactly what to be looking for, but if it doesn't get delivered, the information doesn't get delivered in the proper way, then it doesn't stick with the players, and they just say, okay, well, brush it off, like I'm gonna go do this anyways.
Like, give us a sense of what you mean in that regard, because one of the things I heard from players in your teams, I've noticed actually a lot of the Origen people hold you in very high regard, actually, and give you mad props, like Alphari, I think Upset maybe in an interview said something like that, although Gyoto thinks you're legit, right? What I heard was, a lot of them, like I say, like pros, if people think, imagine how disrespectful pros are publicly, behind the scenes, like I say, loads of pros until recent years, just like, there aren't really coaches, or like, you coach like the fucking rookie, don't coach me, basically. But even worse, if you were like an analyst, they did just think, like I said, you're just a nerd. But I've noticed in your case, what they all say is it's just like the way you present the information is what makes it interesting. Like, essentially, they thought the problem with a lot of analysts and coaches is they're just throwing stuff at a wall and seeing what sticks. But they actually were trying to imply to me that you actually had like essentially, if you brought up like an angle, they said there would be like a logic to it. Like, it would be something about like a style of tendency of what the opponent's going to do, or the way you'd explain like a concept, like this is what we're going to attack. Like, so give us a sense. Like, do you have like a presentation style? Do you focus on certain things? Like, what's the, obviously some of it's the secret sauce, but give us a sense of what it's like. What's a Kayser analysis gig like?
I mean, I can walk you through, like, there's definitely a presentation process. Like, I obviously have like a set amount of things I look at. I think every analyst looks at jungle pathing, but I look at jungle pathing like related to the lanes as well. Like, so this will be like how they use their wards is also important. So you can see, okay, we're most likely going to be playing this type of matchup. They're most likely going to be having a pushing top laner and the first like 3 waves. So you look if they have any vision gaps towards that side of the map. It's definitely a presentation format. Like for best of ones, it's like a 20 slide presentation, maybe 15, it depends. And then I do like individual PowerPoints. I've kind of evolved towards that model where obviously I'm not going to put top laner specific information in the team presentation. And then, it's about at least whenever I present, I give the information, a suggested usage of it, how I think we should use it. And then if I don't have if it's not as tangible as, hey, like this guy literally just doesn't ward like he already wards at level 1, that means he usually has the trinkets will respawn at 4 minutes then. So if you ward at level 1, usually you'll have from between 3 and 4 minutes, you'll have a no warding time. Like you'll have no wards basically. And if there's a consistent trend, then you can look for gank timings off that knowledge. But I mean, if it's not something like that, then I'll at least give a recommendation on how to use the information. Best of 5s is a different entire topic because that gets more into, okay, there's like an early game day, a mid game day, and basically a review day. But it's the same thing in mid game. So
one thing I want to ask about, because an area that I've noticed, which is how players and other people in the scene get won over to the idea that a role does something, is basically most people I've noticed who are good at anything are fairly myopic and they just sort of see the area they're good in and they make that like the whole fucking thing of like, I'm this good at this. So like people will know the famous story that all the coaches try to say in League to make it sound like they're not like stepping on the players' toes. They'll always say this, like, obviously I'm not going to teach Perkz how to play like LeBlanc. Like that's the obvious one, right? Or like whatever, insert whatever champion you want, right? But the part I actually feel like that misses and almost does a disservice to coaches when you say that to a fan is you make it sound like you let the player handle all the playing and you just tell him small stuff. But I'll tell you one thing players are terrible at. Macro. And by the way, that's nothing to do with how good you are as a player. It's because individually, when you play solo queue, you aren't playing a 5v5 team game of League of Legends. And if people don't know, even when we just say that term macro, which in itself is a macro in language, that we're just taking all these concepts and bundle them under one little word, it's ever evolving, isn't it? And the whole reason why it's fascinating to watch like Korean League of Legends is like you see the chess game evolve over time and you see like, right, what was good macro one week isn't as good next week if someone figures out a better dragon setup or something. So the area I do think you can have insane impact is with areas like that, like teaching player teams essentially, what is our team identity? What's our team colour, as they say in Korea? One area I wanted to ask you about particularly was, because it sort of implied what you were saying is, I also feel like an area that players can massively benefit from coaching staff is sometimes when they join a player, maybe they know who they are as a player, but they don't know what role they could do in this team. Like they don't know, like even simple things like how we're going to streamline the team, who are we going to play through, what lanes, like as you say, like what kind of style of jungle are we going to use? Are you going to have to be self-sufficient? Is someone going to help you at certain times? A lot of that stuff, it seems like players actually, they're way more lost than they give on it off in public. I feel like you can have an immense impact on teams in that sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty, I think I picked that up first from that FNATIC team in 2018. I think that was the first team where I saw a noticeable focus. I think Dylan still does this, but he noticed, you could tell that we were specifically selecting champions that suited winning the game. Actually, like basically not a formula, but a certain style that each player should fill.
I mean, I think people have probably seen, especially with last year's team, like he seems pretty good at like sort of band-aiding and figuring out who the weak spot is and just getting them into their comfort zone and sort of keeping away from all the danger. He seems like a very good coach drafting-wise in that sense.
Yeah, like I can even say like initially when I was on FNATIC, I thought it was mainly Joey doing a lot of the work and then myself, and basically we had a really good staff that year, let's just be honest. And then it took me a couple of years to see it after I saw other coaches function,
right?
That I noticed that Dylan had like a specific strength in that, and now I actually think it's probably he did a lot of work, but it's just at the moment I was like, because it was my first large team, sure. I was like, okay, well, I mean, sure, we can pick Hylissang Rakan, but like if you look back at that 2018 year, I think we only picked Hylissang champions that had dashes. We had like Braum.
It's got to be one of his best years ever. If people don't know, this was a fabulous, yes.
Pike. So like any champion that had a dash or a mobility was like the main champions he played, because even to this day he'll saying sometimes it's too far forward and he just gets picked off, or he's like flanking on Tom Kench, old Tom Kench, which was the one where you could only eat people and play front to back, but he was like flanking on the champion, so
Of course.
it's pretty mental. But yeah, I think stylistic, go back to your question, having a style for a team and like who you draft for is, I think, the easiest way to streamline the game. But and especially for the roles, especially if like players aren't that diverse, it makes it pretty simple. Like last year's FNATIC is an example where like it's very clear they're playing to bot lane with Upset. That makes it, if it's that easy to see, like the style of the team, how it should operate. Another one would be like 2017 Cloud9 with Impact Top,
Right.
Sneaky, where they just picked Cho'Gath, Tank Top, and just played the bot lane. It's a little bit simpler to stylistically put a team together if it's like that. The issue that a lot of teams I think run into is when you have good enough players to do every style, they play every single style, and it's just like, what are we actually good at? But yeah, I think that's one way a coach can definitely assist the team the most or enhance the team's performance the most.
Sure. Before we get to some of the big teams, because obviously on the bigger ones, I could just specifically ask, like, what did you do in this era or this series or whatever? Before we get there, the other team that you were on before these big name ones was obviously the eUnited team, which, if people don't know, was a really interesting era, because this was the one where they had up-and-coming people who did become pros, like Zazel and Licorice, players who went on to have their own success, but they also had that weird period where they tried importing Dandy and Ganked by Mom, if people don't remember, the really old-school players. At this point in time, this is when Dandy, and like it was like years since he'd been like the world champion or whatever. Do you have any stories about any of these players? I mean, this is a pretty interesting bunch of people for like a challenger team.
No, I was mainly like, I was a remote analyst for this team. Like, so I basically this was like while I was working with Direwolves.
Right.
I reached out and I just asked if I could volunteer just to build my resume, to particularly maybe eventually work in LCS or LEC. Or eULCS at the time.
Two doubling up two teams at the same time.
Yeah, no, the Australian team didn't give a shit.
Oh, fair enough.
They were just like, we're never gonna see we're never gonna see these guys. So I was like, all right, but yeah, I'm just gonna do this then. But like some challenger NA team, never. So yeah, I was doing like match prep, and then I just reached out to Clerky, because Clerky was working at eUnited at the time, with basically an inward report on themselves. So
right. Were those Korean players washed? Because obviously the fear at that point in their career is if they even come into NA, it's like, what have they got left, you know?
I think Dandy wasn't. I think Dandy was pretty good from my memory. And then who was the other?
Ganked by Mom?
Yeah, he was. So
fair enough. He was toasted.
Yeah, I can't really say much.
Put it this way, all I'll say is I heard behind the scenes, it wasn't just his level of play. Maybe he went a bit nuts and basically like it was a bad state of affairs. Put out well to say that. So why not listen? Yeah, let's talk about FNATIC then. As you say, one of the things about that year, I've even said this to Dylan Falco himself on my shows, and he gets it. It's like, in a way, Youngbok did absolutely cock him that year, because if everyone remembers, obviously the previous years, Youngbok was the head coach of G2 and won all the championships. And then when they joined this year, Dylan Falco had been the coach the year before, and he technically was still the coach. This is where people have to understand the difference where we're using the Korean terminology. Like, essentially, I know they made Youngbok like director of esports. He was essentially like the Korean head coach. Like, he just like leads the culture of the team, practices. But the idea was, what most people think of as coach in League of Legends is Korma from T1. That's the strategic coach. It actually wasn't, if you don't know, guys, until way later in his time in T1 that became Korma's role, where he was the other one. And spoiler, that's when T1 wasn't as sick a team anymore, because someone else did the drafting, right? So in this time period, I agree with you. The sad thing is, everyone remembers, like, then Youngbok won 2 more championships, so he was the greatest coach. And then everyone like deletes Dylan Falco for like history in their brain. Meanwhile, he was there the whole time, and he was working with a similar core of players. So the reason I thought it was interesting was because when you said your vision of how you like come up with the coaching style, I know he's in very much the same vein. Like, I actually know him, if people don't know, before he even became a coach. He used to just be a content creator, and he did a few videos that were about jungle pathing, and then he got a gig at TSM as like a jungle coach or something like that, right? And I know that his whole vision of the game comes from jungle pathing, and if you ever look at his teams, this guy's amazing at working with it, man. Like, the joke right now is he's got like a rookie jungler and he's just perfectly setting this guy up like all fucking day long. So he looks like he's like the best jungler, but he isn't, clearly, if you look at like El Yoya and all those guys. So like, this guy, he clearly has, like, the thing with Dylan Falco for me was just, even though it's like a sports ball analysis, I just didn't know, was he cut out to be like the top coach, you know, with like the big playing players? That's like a different, that is where the young bucks of the world, you know, it's about charisma and do you get the buy-in from the player.
Yeah.
But as an actual like strategic coach, Dylan Falco seems amazing, mate. Like, the more I've seen with all the different teams he was on, like, you can give him those budget Schalke teams, he'll make miracles and be in like the semi-finals. And if you do give him a G2 or FNATIC, he's done it now. He's won the championships. He's been these big places. So can you give me some thoughts on this guy or what it was like to work with him? Did you interact with him in any interesting ways?
Yeah, I mean, I worked with him pretty actively. It was me, Joey, Dylan, and then Michael Garkey was the other person in the FNATIC staff, who was the manager, who's now like Heretics guy. But no, Dylan, him and Joey handled the draft. He obviously handled all the review. Him and Joey they had like a frequent team meetings and player meetings on like how to resolve a lot of team issues. You can imagine that team had multiple team issues throughout the year, just off the players. Not that I'm going to get into too much of it, but
No.
That was a hard roster to handle. But yeah, he just tries to put each player in the right situation to succeed on match day. That's, I think, is his biggest strength, and that's all I can really. It's the shortest way, most concise way to say his strength.
Right, obviously, as you say, it's up to you if you want to tell any stories or just keep it light. But I'll just ask it this way, because when you say that line that you just suggested there, it's something I know a lot about. And people maybe know the next year in FNATIC, which is the same team but with Nemesis instead of Caps.
Yeah.
Famously, there were a lot of problems in that team, and actually people sort of know Youngbuck must have done something good behind the scenes. But they don't know that, dude. One of the stupidest things in League is sometimes the teams that have the success have problems as well. Like, I've heard this team, if people know, this is the year where they had the 2 LEC titles, they were top 4 at MSI, and then they made the final of Worlds. So it's actually, in theory, was supposed to be like the best year ever for a Western team. I've heard mate, there were mad problems. Like, I won't say who, but like certain players absolutely wanted other people kicked from the team. People didn't like the way certain people played. Like, I've heard basically this is like this core was the ultimate version of where you have to band-aid them. Like, if you just left them to, like, if you left them like Lord of the Flies to figure out themselves, people would just kill each other, you know, or they just leave the team. Like, I've heard the coaching staff did an amazing job this year.
Yeah, that roster was extremely difficult to manage. That was the year we had Bwipo. That was Bwipo's first year as well.
With the one where he's also standing in an ADC and all that shit. Yeah, if people remember. Yeah. This is crazy.
There's Bwipo sOAZ, that dynamic that you need to manage appropriately. You have the Rekkles subbing himself out. Bwipo playing AD situation. Then you have the Korean boot camp, which was also a strenuous situation. We were in Korea for a month straight because we went to Korea for 2 weeks boot camp, and then we made it to the very end, and Korea was in Worlds, or Worlds was in Korea. Right. So it was like a month and a couple weeks in Korea. So there's multiple break points that year that I think the roster could have imploded, but we kept it together primarily. I think you needed every single staff member on that team to make it function appropriately.
Let me ask about some of these specifics. As you say, it's like a crazy buffet of options. So one of the aspects which people just delete from their brain completely do, because what was crazy was, to be fair, this didn't even last the whole split. In the summer split, I'll just remind everyone, this is why I'm the esports story mate, I can just do this. Everyone remembers, right? The story always goes like, it's just the post-MSI hangover is the problem. But this split was different, because this was the split where funnel could just be done, like in the middle of the split. Real, I'm talking, if you don't know what I'm talking about, like if you like Dota, you could just do like that. You could just funnel all the gold into one fucking character. In this case, it would be the mid laner, obviously, which, by the way, G2 was doing all the time with Perkz. That was their whole style. But that was also at the beginning of the split, remember, like Misfits was the ones like, we're only playing ADCs, we don't play the mages. So they did it and they went like 8-0 or whatever. I was like, maybe that works. Yeah. But then, because Rekkles himself, who obviously in theory should have been the ultimate, like, I just play ADCs, he was like, actually, I think this isn't even good. I'm benching myself. So then Bwipo came in, who'd obviously subbed in for sOAZ when sOAZ broke his hand in the spring playoffs. He comes in, but as AD, but to play mages, because he does play Swain and all this ridiculous shit. So at the same time in the league, you have like G2 super funneling Perkz, as though like he's like the one player, like Superman, to save the whole day. In your team, you've got mages in the bot lane, and so you've simultaneously got that weird sOAZ style of like late game fucking top lane, with like a mage in the bot, no ADC, Rekkles just sat on the bench. And FNATIC was still like a top team, so like, what the fuck is this era like to coaching? Because when you do that as well, kids, you've got to know as well, like, there's no way Riot's going to let like this funnel meta, this mage meta stay forever. Like, it's going to get nerfed at some point, right? How do you even operate in that scenario? Like, that team probably should have blown up, right?
Yeah, you would think it would blow up. I think that's more to Joey and Dylan's doing, the how the team functioned in that vein. I was only the.
What did you think, like, analytically though, about that era of League of Legends? Pretty wild, right?
I mean, I think the funneling is obviously, I think, should not be viable in the game, but it is because they made gold items. And then Riot still to this day has not figured out how to functionally operate with the gold items, in my opinion. Maybe it's better now, but even last year there was that era where they had the Sonateric, or 2 years ago, and then they had last year where they're using support items top. So there's since 2018 they've had many iterations where they haven't been able to make that itemization work, but that's a different point. In terms of how the style of the team work, I think that was also, I think the funnel was a little bit before the mage part.
Oh, right, they didn't overlap, right, okay.
Yeah, that was, the funnel was in the beginning of spring at some point, and then in summer they just completely nerfed all the AD carry items. So basically mages became strong. We tried playing, that was the era, if you remember Doublelift as well, like earlier in that year, tried playing Vladimir AD carry, and then he just forgot how to use his R.
It was pretty bad.
Yeah, he forgot what his R button did or something. So there's like, we tried playing with Rekkles as mages, and he just opted not to. And then Bwipo could already play Swain, and Swain Pike was like a really good combo, so we just rolled with that. So yeah, that it's definitely a little bit more challenging to. I think League at that time was a little bit more like, you could still play a certain way. That was before dragon stacking was viable.
Yes,
like there was many different styles you could play in that type of meta. Like that was when like split pushing was still viable. Like I think you had KT. If you remember the KT IG series, they had like split pushing 1 HP Fiora Nexus. And you could also play team fights. So I think stylistic diversity was different in that time of League. But I don't think the game changed too much after early game if you just snowballed. But how the team function was mainly on those changes, and balancing all that was mainly Dylan and Joey, I would say.
What would you say, actually, by the way, to the whole thing of, obviously, the mess that year was that year, right? If people don't know, it really is pure coincidence that Bwipo even ever got to play. It's just because sOAZ, like, broke his hand during, like, the spring playoffs. Then in came Bwipo to play top lane. It went well, they won. And then in came this weird era where he could play the major. It's like, it's almost like the fate just kept inserting Bwipo. Because if people don't know, originally it would have just been sOAZ. And if people don't know, sOAZ was very good at this time. In fact, one of the things I know he feels very aggrieved by is he was even good at that Worlds. It's just he didn't get to play most of the games, and then he just got brought in at the end when the game was over. It was like 2-0, and it was like essentially like, do you want to take part in this beat? And it's like, well, I guess I better add on. Like, but I know it sucked. So what I wanted to ask you was this: obviously at the time, everything did look amazing for Bwipo. If people don't know, he already was a guy who'd been like spamming Swain as like a one trick in fucking solo queue even before it was in the meta. Trick. Exactly. So like, it was essentially like everything was like just given a reason to play him. Who do you actually think was the better top laner? Like, do you actually think it was the right move to take Bwipo and to do these swaps? What do you think?
I think we had like both those top laners were like top 3 in their role at the time. I think for spring and then I think summer playoffs we used sOAZ primarily. I think for Worlds, I think either top lane. I don't think we would have probably beaten IG in the final because the meta switched. The meta changed over that course of Worlds. If you remember, like the bottom lane focus teams, like G2 beat freaking RNG, which had like the bot lane carry, and then IG beat KT, and both KT, RNG, and FNATIC were all bottom side focus teams. It's just like once I think Victor top became a flex, like there became a couple more champions developed over the tournament, and then there just became too many flex champions you could play between solo lanes. That's when Aatrox was also like crazy overpowered or overtuned. So I think the teams that could flex between the most solo lanes were going to win that tournament towards the end. But how I think the balance worked, I think sOAZ could have played. I don't think the world final result would have changed. Maybe it would have. Like I can't play hindsight too much. But I think the meta more so dictated the results because we still won spring and summer. I can't really say we would have finished any differently.
Fair enough.
I think for the worlds, I think the argument for using Bwipo at the time was he could play Swain. He was better at Victor Top, and then I think at the time the coaching staff and team had a perception he was better at Ornn.
Right.
At the time, I think that was the argument, but even then, like it's hard to say. Like, how do you say who's better at Ornn when they're both like pretty solid at it?
Right, one of the things about this year, as you mentioned, a detail people might not realise is, even though you had Bwipo doing these shenanigans in the top lane, that team obviously was a team that played like mid to fucking bot, because this was actually when, even though he had those issues in the summer where he benched himself, Rekkles was like justifiably the MVP of the spring split. And at Worlds, quite frankly, even though everyone remembers Caps from this year, dude, I actually thought Rekkles was better than Caps at Worlds that time. Like, Caps had a whole bunch of int games. Like, he almost tried to give that fucking EDG series away, mate. He was in all over the place. Whereas, like, actually, Rekkles, like you say, like, the team played very well when they played this style. Like, he was a very good bot laner this year.
Yeah, I think Rekkles had that was one of his best years. Like, he was set up pretty well. Like, I don't know how it is anymore. Like, he's I think this year he's not playing as well. The split he didn't play as well. But back in 2018, if you got him to the mid game, you had a feeling that like he wasn't going to make a team fighting error if the rest of the team knew how to position around him. I think you can remember, I think the EDG game 3 or game 2, I think iBoy like dashed in and just completely gave the game away. It just felt like in the team fight phase we could stand toe to toe with all of the teams, as long as we got to the mid game in like a stable situation. So I think Rekkles had like a really one of his better years, I would say, in terms of performance, all things considered. Him being like benching himself, and then
What did you think in terms of, because the key word you said there is like, if you can get him to that point. Like, the thing I've heard about Rekkles is, it's like, it's not even as simple as people think. People think he's just a diva, so you just do everything he says. No, it doesn't mean, by the way, he himself has like a perfect vision of how he wants to be used and play. I would say actually, he actually wants just people he trusts to sort of like stay the game so he's comfortable. And then, as you say, if you get him to like a team fight and he's not down in CS and down in items, he's just going to clean up. He's one of the best ever at dancing on the fucking edge of the, can I do damage? Yeah. Can I be hit damage? It's like, obviously, when it goes badly, it looks like he's baiting everyone. Like, yeah, that's maybe this split. But when it works, like in this team, it looks really good. Like, he's one of the best ever at that style. Like, one thing I would ask is this, though. A bit like that story of him benching himself. I have heard the tricky thing with him, though, is he's not the guy who's just like, you tell me what to play. It's like he's got his champions that he feels comfortable at that time. And every now and then, there'll just be a meta champion he just decides, like, that's not for me, whatever. So I wondered, is it tricky to actually like build the draft around him? Do you have to have a set like couple that you just always based around these 2 or 3 or something?
Yes, yeah. I can 100% say it's definitely tricky to build the draft around. MSI, there was another example of this where like for some reason we refused to play Xayah with Rakan.
Which is wild when you have Hillsang as a Rakan player as well in it, I know. And it's even the self-peel champion. Like, you'd think Rekkles should love this fucking combo, shouldn't he? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's because we were always like diving in too deep or something.
Exactly.
And then it took to like, if you go back and look at the records of all the MSI tournament, I think it was like the last game when like we're doing like tiebreakers to make it to the playoff stage. We're finally saying like, oh, we can finally play this matchup.
Right.
And it was just it just took going to like extreme lengths for us to basically select champions that inherently should be good in the meta. I think Rekkles still to this day has like a certain set amount of champions that he wants to play and focuses on like perfecting those matchups, which isn't a bad style in all things considered. It's just, it definitely limits the champion or composition diversity when you know that's how they're going to be picking, which is ultimately the downfall of, not the downfall, but that's what happened. Like we couldn't draft various different styles at Worlds because of that, which got us pretty far, all things considered. But
Right, this is obviously the first year when people did really notice Caps. Like before that, in his rookie year, he was an up and down player. He was a coin flip player. He definitely played super fucking aggro. Like this, if people don't know that era, this is a definition of a player who was like limit testing in fucking real games. Like he had some outrageous hints and mad, like don't like refuse to use a flash when someone's coming in like level 3 in the lane. Like he had some really bad ones back then. So what I want to know is this: like, how do you use a player like that? Because obviously when they pop off, it looks easy. Like you just but the problem is, it's like Hiller's saying, identifying the difference between the pop off and the int. It's tricky when you work with players like this.
I think that era was a little bit different. I don't think there was a mid jungle in Europe that could contest Caps early in the lane phase. Even Perkz at that. I think Perkz could. I think Jankos was on that. Perkz Jankos was the two that could at the time. But even then, Caps was playing. His lane phase was like ridiculously good, and that was also the meta where jungle pathing was quite streamlined. I did a lot of work with Broxah on his opposition scouting and like setting up. That was when Scuttle spawned at like 1 minute 1:30, so it was like red into Scuttle. It was Xin Zhao, Camille jungle.
Yep.
So it was a lot easier to streamline pathings with him, and also how enemies should path. Like okay, we have pushing mid, losing jungle matchup, losing bot. You go these two camps, Scuttle, kite the Scuttle left, and then because you're kiting the Scuttle towards your pushing lane in a lot of these instances. But yeah, Caps, it was when you have a good player, I think it's just pretty. You give him a lot of leeway. I think Dylan still does give Caps a lot of leeway in his picks, mainly just because I think if you tell him not to play something, usually that can ruin his creativity or joy for playing, because that was also the era where Caps, I don't know if he still is like this. I still think he is, but I haven't worked with him directly. But he used to just play solo queue like at 3 a.m. Like I mean, because I was with FNATIC. I started with FNATIC at 2017 Worlds, and like there was stories where Caps would like show up to Korea, go to sleep, then like sneak out into the playroom and play, or like games were played and play at like 4 a.m. till scrims and fall asleep in scrims, like in draft. Like, so I don't think killing creativity towards a player would be suggested. And Dylan definitely doesn't like that because it gives him a huge edge in draft if you can play like various flex champs. So I think you kind of just let him play whatever he wants, and then just trust him that he knows what he's doing primarily. Yeah, it was the year we also like locked in Vayne in like a crucial game. And he ended up making the game-winning play, but the pick didn't look good before that play. Let's be honest.
It didn't even look that good during it, mate. It was just that play was sick and they won the game. So it's all cool. Yeah, forget about it, right?
Yeah. Like I'm like, are we really picking Vayne mid? And I'm like, this can't be. Like I'm sitting. I'm like, this can't be serious. But then it works out. So it's like, okay, well, no one history is going to be said.
Don't
like,
worry
okay,
about it.
The pick worked, but it wasn't picked again.
Since you alluded to it already, I should obviously just broach into, let's talk about the Broxah issue a little bit, right? The problem is this is one of the years where I really saw the difference between like people who can actually like look at the strategical side of the game and people who just look at like, it's FNATIC and wow, World's Finals, like, because unfortunately, right, loads of the people who came on my shows after this period, after season 8, basically said, yeah, we all agree, if you look at Worlds, Broxah looked awesome. We had like some crazy pop-off games on Lee Sin. He went to the finals. But a lot of people pointed out the flaws that he had as a jungler. And quite frankly, they did manifest themselves in the coming years on FNATIC, on Team Liquid. Look, it's not, put it this way, if people don't know behind the scenes, he's a very well-liked guy. Everyone loves to work with this guy. It's just they thought he had certain key flaws as a jungler. Some of it I've heard is like maybe he didn't always have the initiative of what the opponent was doing or couldn't track them, or maybe he was someone who needed like to be sort of told what to do a bit, which is why people imply it was best when he was with Caps, because if you're with Caps, you sort of just follow him. Like whenever he fucking just sets off on the map, you just go, right, go with him, or he comes with you and just fucks him up in the jungle. So can you give me some thoughts? Because the problem I always had was I always felt like people thought it was being mean to Broxah, but I think if you just look at his career, like you look at the players he had the success with, the coaches he had, it just seems like he did have some flaws that people, wasn't even that they were able to cut, they should be able to help him with them.
Yeah, I mean, my opinion on Broxah was he performed his best when the plan was streamlined by staff, or the style in which the team plays is streamlined, or it's made very clear to him who to follow, how to play. The problem came when he had to basically adopt adapt on the fly. And that's where I think the drop off was shown, especially if he didn't feel like, especially if like the style that the team was playing. You saw this in the Team Liquid year. Wasn't it evolved each game? Like some teams, you can't just say, okay, we have the best top laner, we're playing to top. We have the best mid, we're playing to mid. 2021 this past year, FNATIC, we have Upset, we are playing to bot. Like sometimes if it's not that streamlined, you have to be a little bit more fluid in game on like which lane you're supporting each game to win. And I think that's where Broxah probably took a step back, or did take a step back. And I can't really speak on like how he functioned in a Team Liquid, but I think that would be the main criticism. Which obviously, if the jungle him being unable to adapt is got to play a part in why he slowly deteriorated over the years, especially with how Riot changed the jungle yearly, and they still do that, which is beyond. I think they need to make larger changes to the game, not related to just adding pets and changing jungle, but I think that's probably the lack of adaptability over time probably was the downfall of Broxah's career. Not downfall, but like how it kind of spiraled to the end, and then now he's a content creator. Still a likable guy though. Like I never had a negative interaction with him.
Right, when it comes to the actual Worlds final, because obviously, like, it's rare that European or Western teams even get in position where you're in, like, a final. And there's even, like, if people don't know, this one was very interesting, because this is the one where, even though now everyone goes, it's obvious IG was going to win, dude, a lot of people were vibing with FNATIC and thought maybe they could do it, because obviously in the group stage, they won their 2 games, because they had the tiebreaker game, and it was 2-1. Obviously, if people don't know, with the KT series, made you think, hey, maybe IG's beatable. Like, I will say, once they bodied G2, it was a little bit like, yeah, I don't know about that. They do look pretty good. But if people don't know, this is the problem I have, right, is I want you to theory craft for me if there actually was a way to beat them. Because when I look at that team, dude, right, I admit fully, even though I'm a massive fan of, like, Rookie, I'm a massive fan. I think he's insanely good. And I also do think the Shy, when he was at his peak like this, was probably the best ever to play the role. But I actually sort of low-key hate IG in this sense case, which is, I actually think that they are the crazy luckiest team ever. Because if I look at the way the tournament and the meta evolved, not only did they have far and away the god fucking solo laners, but you know everyone loved Ning in this final. It's like the universe just told him, like, here's the one simple way to play. Like what you just described about the scuttle is all he did every game, because spoiler, his solos were ahead every single game. He would just get the first scuttle, like, and he was on Xin Zhao every fucking time he could. Then in the bot lane, they had shit like Kayser for Jackalope, which is just perfect for him. And Baolan, who I think is one of the most fraudulent winners ever. This is the era when, like, Rakan, like, his one pick was just like OP. Like, dude, it's like the world just wanted IG to win this match, man. I don't know if anyone could have beaten this team on this exact era and meta. What do you think?
I mean, yeah, I think it was pretty difficult to beat them. I mean, the style that Team Liquid we used in 2019 to beat them at MSI was a very similar style to how to beat them in 2018 Worlds. Right. Which is why Kayser was really good for them. I do agree with that, because that champion allows you to. IG still had a tendency with this team to over dive into you.
For sure, yeah.
And Kayser was like the perfect champion for this, that could just fly into the backline and dive with them. So the style that we used on TL was the same. Basically, we played in spots of the map where we knew they were going to engage into us, and we could have an advantageous position if the gold's even and beat them. And that was the same style we used on FNATIC. But I think the meta just hit them on the head that year. Like they had the solo lanes that could flex Victor, Ryze, Jace, Aatrox. I think Urgot was strong then. I forget how many. There was like
really, there was like a million things you could put between mid and top, wasn't there? Yeah.
Oh, really? There was like 7 flexes, and we couldn't find champions.
Yeah.
That would.
Jace, mate, it was mental how many there was back then. It was nuts, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and then the scuttle meta kind of hid Ning's weaknesses, which we then exposed on Team Liquid once they put that hey, we're stronger, level 2. We go with the scuttle and we just invade you and fight you. Sure, that works if your solos are winning. We can't really beat it at that time, but once that simple way of playing was removed, it was a lot easier to expose Ning. And then Baolan, I never had a high opinion on. Still don't have a high opinion on him, but I still think he was just along for the ride at those events, and I think that's fine. I mean, you need to have role players, but
sure.
The public perception of overrating their bot lane, I think, was a little bit hyperbolic.
Sure.
So
I mean, as you say, though, the thing that was so crazy about this was normally, right, if you're a Western coach, like, that's just the end of the story for you. Like, you're supposed to spend the rest of your career, like, every day just thinking about that day. What could I have done differently? Like, you had the maddest scenario ever, because even though you changed teams to Team Liquid, the very next international tournament, literally the next best of 5, you just got to play the same fucking team. And you know what's mad? They won't even have known you were involved with FNATIC. So, like, you even had, like, an information advantage on them. So it must have been wild, because you just got a chance. This was people forget this was the same IG, and everyone now downplays it because they hate on NA. Like, oh, they had all like arguments. Like, bro, if people don't remember, in that group stage, they were dusting everyone off. Fucking G2, T1, they looked like they were going to win this whole tournament, that IGT. They were mega scary. So, like, in this scenario, even though now people downplay, no one expected TL could win this. It was supposed to be impossible. I mean, as you say, all the players were so highly rated. Like, imagine telling fans, like, oh, yeah, like, fucking, like, Jackie Love's going to do worse than, like, Doublelift or something. They wouldn't believe you, or Rookie's not going to outperform Jensen, etc. Like, this series should have been impossible. So give me some thoughts. Like, what actually was done in this series, do you think? Because as you say, to me, it's the most obvious example of, like, I'm sure TL themselves even knew we're not supposed to be favourites. So it feels like they were primed to listen to, like, here's the things we can actually do, because the team played very differently than the usual style, right? It wasn't just like scale up at macro only, right?
Yeah, no, it wasn't at all. Like I've already kind of disclosed this kind of what we did, but we before the tournament started, we had all of the preps complete for every single opponent, and probably IG was the most comfortable. Like the team, once we played them a couple times, we realized like the prep was pretty spot on, and it was like the win conditions were feasible to beat that team. Like Ning was consistently ganking off of wave like if the waves crashing in, he would sit.
Oh, it was predictable. You could just sort of see by the wave, right?
Yeah. There's still junglers in the LEC that have this predictability. Sure. I can't expose who those are, but Ning was. I showed probably 15, 11, like 12 clips. Like mainly recent ones, and then I would span it back to years prior, how it's the same pattern, but now it's just a lot more exposable. And then basically we had Smithy just sacrifice his own leads to guard wave pushouts, and then the whole year we were going over map design, like areas in the map that are more suited towards our comp, which I kind of, if you followed like me into TSM, how the teams played, it also was very similar to the style, because I think if team fight meta was, or being able to outwin team fights on positional advantage is probably one of the better ways to play League.
It's never going to go out of fashion, put it that way.
Yeah, it's never, no matter what meta Riot decides to do with the game, it'll still be an important piece. And this also goes down to lane setups, but yeah, that's kind of the style we used to beat IG. And then there was also a lot of minute stuff in the prep that I looked at for, I can give like, if maybe people won't remember this, but there was, when IG had Baron in game 2, we had Alistar, and IG were shifting from their Baron siege. They wouldn't, whenever they're shifting to their third side lane, they wouldn't check the side lane middle bush after T1. And like Core got a flank on their back line when they were sieging that from that bush on Alistar, where like it just completely neutralized their Baron, which ended up giving us Elder or something, if I remember correctly. But there's like many instances where the prep was utilized to beat them in game. And then in draft, the meta was also kind of aligned for us. And also during the group stage, the team built confidence playing against them because all of our games versus IG were really close.
That's true, actually. The one thing people forget is, even though obviously IG was beating everyone in this group stage, the difference is they used to stomp other people in like 20 minutes. TL was like hanging in these games, I remember.
Yeah, because like a lot of the way IG snowballed fit poorly against how we how we played the game.
Yes.
So over map zones of control is how it was one of the core ways to beat them. So like it just so happened that stylistically we're close enough to how to counter them. And then also on top of all the prep and then just overconfidence, like we had nothing to lose. Like it was like either we're going to get, if we went, like people were expecting us to win one game as a success. So it was any games would be positive. And then after game 1, it kind of just snowballed. And yeah, and then in terms of 2018 FNATIC, I think the finals could have gone either way. But Like IG wouldn't scrim us, the FNATIC team, leading up to the
Right.
semifinal
Okay.
because they scrimmed us one time. We like 5-1'd them, and they got tilted for the whole day.
Okay.
And so they wouldn't even warm up versus us. So I really think that was also like if we woke up on a better day, we could have maybe won. But I still think IG was heavy favorites.
Okay.
Due to the other stuff we already talked about, like the meta hitting them on the head.
By the way, in Liquid, I actually did want to ask about the way this team was set up as well, because obviously this is the era where this was the year where CoreJJ is there and he's winning like the MVP. Doublelift's still there, of course. But one thing I noticed was very weird is I actually felt like a lot of people like talked shit on this bot lane dude, because what they expected was, it's like because of Doublelift and Doublelift's reputation, like to actually get props, he has to almost just be like Uzi Eye and just be like win every lane, like get every kill, just play like and that, if you notice in this era, especially with CoreJJ, that's not at all how this bot lane played. Like there's a reason CoreJJ got all the MVPs. Like it was way more controlled team. Even like we're talking about the team setup, this is a team that often came from behind and scaled up and won in team fights.
Yeah.
Like, so what would you describe? Because if to me it's one of those ones where there must be more nuances to what was going on here, because I've heard like in your ear you thought this was a pretty good bot lane and it functioned very well in the game, right? So what was the style of how you use these players, do you think?
I think it was a constant playing. It was like on a string where Core wanted to play the more vision control river style to play, and Doublelift wanted to play more lane focused, which I think both have warrants. I think we more so tilted towards Doublelift style of play, but we still use Core to control. But we just played mid to bot. I think Core in the future years just preferred playing roaming style. So I think it was finding the tightrope balance between the two. But I think especially that year, it was advantageous that we played towards bottom, because I think if you play away from Doublelift, you're not going to utilize his strengths as much. I think maybe now you can, where he can play more weak side. But at that time in 2019, if you have to think back, like that was the year where he was he was lane dominant. I think that was his still peak of his powers in terms of his play. And then Core was still good enough in lane at the time. I think his lane phase has fallen off as the Enchanter meta has kind of rose up. I think Core used to be really good at the Enchanter meta. That's when he won Worlds in 2017, when it was like Ardent meta. But I think after years of focusing on engages, his skill level and that dropped off. But I think now, it was constantly pushing Core to go back to bot lane instead of sitting around mid or top or roaming to an extent. We basically, with the map design stuff, we stressed to Doublelift the spots in the map that he could fight in per his champions. So that stuff matters most for carries, because they're dictating the team fights. About like, okay, you have a front to back comp, or you have like a certain champ that can't get flanked. There's like, you don't want to be extending past these lines on the map. Here's the logical reason why. Here's 20 clips of people doing it poorly are getting exposed for this reason. And once the 80 carries, if they're carries, like they understand it and they truly believe in it, then they can call, hey, I'm not going to fight. I'm not going to fight here. So the rest of the team impact will not extend forward, because the carries aren't extending forward. So if you teach a couple of roles in the team the concepts, then the rest of the players will usually have to play around those conditions. So sometimes you don't need to teach the whole team concepts. You teach the whole team concepts, but certain roles need to understand more in depth why.
Yes.
And if they have big enough personalities, which Doublelift has a big enough personality, then it's not an issue.
By the way, I'll ask this as like a naive outsider, but I'll be interested to see what you say. One thing I'm always surprised by is the number of stories. Like I was alluding to earlier about how pros know certain things, and then what they don't know, they sometimes know very little of. It is actually shocking sometimes, the stories I've heard of some of the Western pros. Like some of them were big names as well, dude, who just don't understand basic wave manipulation concepts, or even like sometimes what the wave state's going to be in their game at different times. Like some of them, it's real. Like those stories are real. Like you can pause the game and ask them, like, where's it going to be here? And some of them are just sort of like, just guessing, like, yeah, it's like, to a fan, maybe they think this is like, what the hell is that? How could you be a pro? Like, what would you say to this? I feel like that's an area where, to me as well, the best coaches fucking do miracles.
Yeah, I mean, wave manipulation is still something I think a lot of pros don't understand. Like, sometimes it's better to not like if the enemy laner, especially on side lanes, is trying to trade into you using like, and you only have AoE spells to trade back, sometimes it's better to just lose a couple CS so you don't AoE spell the wave, because that's going to put the wave at a bad position when the enemy jungler is pathing up to your lane. So it's both working with your jungler, knowing where he's at, and knowing when to give up CS so you can stack the wave, knowing not to use AoE spells on the wave, and so it freezes in a spot where you can get ganked. I think there's Bwipo was one person that understood this really well. I think it was a little bit easier for him though, because I think even like his Korean solo QID was "I will trade," so he would just trade his entire health bar at like level 1 or level 2 because he knew Broxah was pathing top and Caps was probably gonna win mid.
Yes.
So he would just trade the entire HP bar before his jungler is gonna get to the lane, and then it's like, okay, well that's just like an easy kill now. So that's another thing. I still think pros are not very aware. It's constantly ongoing because you have to be synchronized with your jungler.
Oh, for sure. Yes.
Like Alphari is really good at this as well, where he would tell the top laner or the jungler exactly when to be top for his matchup to be played out. Especially because this is still when he was playing Gangplank a lot, and like Gangplank was usually the laner that could stack waves base. If we could stack waves, we have mid push, we can dive. If you remember the 2021 CoreJJ was like 4-man top against in that TL era. That's when they had tactical playing like solo bot. So yeah, I still think wave manipulation is not a well perfected skill set amongst all pros. Which I think there should be one or a staff member or 2 staff members that understand this concept well on the staff, or like a jungle positional coach or a jungler that understands. It's like, I'm sure Yankos.
The dream is to have the jungler, like you say, no, because then it just solves half the problems. Like if you've got Yankos, he's just going to path correctly towards the right lane anyway. You don't have to tell him, right?
Yeah, if that's like that's the perfect scenario where then you can spend resources or staff bandwidth on other issues. But if that's a constant revolving problem, you can't really progress as a team early game if that's a constant issue.
Yes. One last player to ask about on the TL era was obviously Jensen. This is the year when he came in as the mid laner and was like, obviously there's a lot of expectations, etc. What did you think about him as a mid laner? Because one thing I've noticed in his career is maybe because he himself, a bit like Doublelift, was sometimes on teams where it was like he just had to be like the main carry if they're going to win the game. Right? A lot of that did seem to affect him even when he joined teams like this where you had all the big names. Like he's another player for me where it's like, it's a bit like Reckless in mid lane. It's like if you give him his right champions, look, his lane style's different. He's going to be lane dominant. But it's like if you give him the right champions and the right setup, he'll be amazing and he'll just play an awesome game. But it's not as simple as just draft him anything, I'll tell you that. He's definitely not that type of player.
No, I think you kind of hit it on the head. You kind of have to put him in an advantageous scenario. But he's pretty adamant in review about like conditions for him to do well in the game, like what he needs.
Right. He's good at communicating it, right?
Yeah, like especially if he's in like mage matchups, he would constantly not scream, but he would argue pretty aggressively to get vision for his lane and contest vision. It's still this way to this day. If it's like a Cinder Zoe matchup, whoever has the river control is usually who wins that game, because you don't know if the person's roaming or they can push with the jungler behind. Like, so whoever has river control usually wins those matchups. And in this era, it was mainly a lot of mage matchups mid.
For sure.
We didn't play I think we tried playing a couple melees mid, but that was like a spring split, one couple weeks, and then, okay, guys, we're not playing Aurelia mid with Jensen. Let's drop that. So that was like ego tripping. Like, okay, yes, I can play Aurelia, and then you play Aurelia. You can lock it in, but no, I think he needs certain conditions to be successful. I think it was shown the best on what was his last year on C9. I think when Blabber was like his first year, I think it was when Blabber just constantly played to mid with the Kindred meta, Kindred Zillion, stuff like this. And then it was also shown this past year where C9 won LCS by playing primarily just everyone go mid. So I think if Jensen's played around, he still has the ability to carry most games in NA. I think his skill level has dropped off, though, over the years.
Sure.
But I don't know what to attribute that to other than lack of. I think he stopped playing the game as much.
He's not that big. He's not a grinder. If people don't know, he's the guy in the off season who does just chill, as far as I know. And he definitely doesn't play solo queue a million hours during the season. Yeah, he's just a strange guy like that. He's not one of the guys who's like a fucking. I've heard it's the same with Humanoid. They just play when they feel like it, or to get into shape, or whatever the fuck, Which, spoiler, just doesn't mean you'll be the best player for 10 years in a row. You'll have your down periods where you're not feeling the game and it's just not going well, of course. Right. One thing I have to ask is this though: does this imply, by the way, that like, what happened in Team Liquid? Because the thing about this is you didn't even get to stay the whole year. Like, you were there, you did the MSI period, then you were just suddenly in like the Origen team or whatever. Like, what happened? Did they not value your role? How did you end up over in Europe after that?
That's like more of it's nothing related to ability or skill. That was more so related to.
Wasn't it implied like someone inside the org just fired you, like get the fuck out, whatever? Like,
yeah, it's like a personal situation. I think it was somewhat justified. I think like they could have put me on like probation or something. I'm not going to go into this too much, but I did think that they made a decision that was worse for the results, and that's all I can say. I do think it was justified. Though, like I don't hold any bad grievances over it.
Fair enough.
It is what it is. So I think it's water under the bridge at this point.
The Beatles said they get by with a little help from their friends, but I get by with a little help from my Patreon community. And this video was kindly supported by Matt Pugnaccio Racula, Ahmed Haju, Bot Pounder 420, Toucan, Animosity, Tobias Bernasconi, Jensen Gore, Tosh, and a special thanks always goes out to my main man, Jerky's Minion. Would you like to ask me a question in my monthly video AMA? Do you want teasers to find out who are the upcoming guests? Maybe you want to take part in one of those lengthy but intense esports discussions I have with my donators, or maybe you want to suggest a guest or a topic that I could cover. Well, if any of those tickle your fancy, put your money where your mouth is and join the Skrilluminati today, where in the description box below there is a Patreon link.